right, good morning, everybody. If you've been paying attention these last couple days, you'll know that the future is a scary place. There's a lot of challenges that we as a human race are going to be facing in the future, from energy and climate, inequality, development around the world. I think that we tend to underestimate the challenges that we're going to get from biology, from the fact that we're entering an era where for the first time we human beings can do things to our own biology that would have been completely unprecedented, not even thought of in years before. So we need to face up to this set of challenges. It's an fascinating area that's at the intersection of science, of political philosophy, and law. So we have the perfect person to talk to us about some of these challenges that are coming up. Professor Alta Charo is a professor at the law school, the Walter Knowles Professor of Bioethics at the law school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She served on the transition team for the Obama administration, and she advised them about issues like stem cells and women's reproductive rights. And she's written about just about every issue in this area, from designer babies to the conflicts that we get between religious conscience and what that says about what you're allowed to do biologically, vaccines, and stem cell editing, the whole gamut that we're going to be exposed to today. So she'll give a talk and inspire you, and in the question and answer session, feel free to ask about any of the issues that are in this area. So please welcome Professor Alta Charo.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Ben Rosen, who asked me to do topics 1, 3, and 4 of the 4 topics I pitched to him. So we're going to be having a rather fast-moving pace in this particular talk. They say that there are only 2 things that are certain in life, death and taxes, and I would suggest that only one of those is actually true. Because, as for those of you who were here earlier, know, in 2013, a young girl died after surgery in California. And the California coroner, looking at this condition, and experts looking at her condition, declared her to be dead based upon a complete absence of activity in her brain, including the brain stem, which controls most of your autonomic nervous functions. Her mother and father did not believe she was dead, because as Sean alluded to, people have different views based on their religious faith, and in their faith, you're not dead until your heart and lungs stop. And with machine assistance, her heart and lungs were continuing to work, and they viewed her as alive. They went to court to prove that she was alive, and California court said, we define death as the complete absence of brain function or the cessation of heart and lungs. She meets the criteria, she's dead. So they said, no, you're violating our religious rights, but still we're going to do something beyond that. And they moved her to New Jersey, which is one of only 2 states that allow people to redefine the legal concept of death in accordance with their own religious beliefs, New York being the other one. And so we had a really strange situation in which in 2013 we had a death certificate issued by the County of Alameda in California, but in New Jersey we didn't get a definite declaration of her death until just a couple of months ago, when additional complications finally led to the cessation of heart and lung function. So the question really is, first, what is brain death? And second, why should that be the way in which we define death for legal purposes? In other words, brain death, we always thought was the irreversible end of all brain functions, but in fact what we've learned is that it's a little more complicated than that. Because even after you have experienced this complete loss of brain function, you can still have a variety of things going on, including your wounds can still be healing, and your hormones can still be balancing. So it's not surprising that some people view this as still being alive. And indeed, I suspect for some of you who've had the unfortunate experience of knowing somebody who was killed suddenly, for example, in a car crash, having a conversation in which somebody said, yes, they told us he was brain dead, so we removed life support, which is a strange concept for somebody who's dead, and now he's really dead, right? So this idea that there's brain dead, really dead, Grateful Dead, and it led to the question of whether or not death is a legal construct as opposed to a biological construct. And we do, in fact, have laws that try to define death, and we need them because we need them for very practical reasons. Can a spouse remarry? Can the property be transferred to heirs? These are legal questions, and in some ways, it doesn't really matter if somebody is biologically dead or not, medically dead or not, because as long as they have permanently exited the human community and the ability to experience rights and responsibilities, it makes sense to ask what rights and responsibilities should the law attribute to them once they are beyond the capacity to experience them. It leads really to a very basic question is, should we actually just say legal death and medical death don't have to be the same at all? So we have examples where we know that it's a legal fiction. We have a guy that was missing, he's declared dead because you have to move on. But he comes back 20 years later. So we know to a certainty he wasn't dead, but his property was in fact transferred. Now there are remedies for these issues, and you have to have remedies, but you wouldn't want to have to wait until you knew that his body had decayed before you were allowed to do these things. And indeed, even for the purpose of probate, two people who die very close in time, even if we know they didn't die simultaneously, are deemed to have died so that there's no reason to have one person's property pass to another who's only going to be living for an additional half hour before it goes to the next party. It can have a lot of implications. But it's not just death. Every part of our lives that has any kind of definition that's used in social or legal circles is one where we have had a tendency, on the one hand, to think that biology is the only way to define things, even when it's inconvenient for social purposes, like deciding who gets the property or who gets to get married, and yet at the same time, we constantly engage in fictions, and we haven't really decided what we want to do. In the area of sex, for example, women have for years been subjected to really humiliating sex tests to prove that they really are eligible to run on the women's team in things like the Olympics. It used to be that women paraded in front of gynecologists while naked so that their genitals could be examined. More recently, the great advance was using genetics and chromosomal analysis. A person who presents as a woman but had a Y chromosome would be declared ineligible because she was a man, not a woman. That's the meaning of the Y chromosome. Even if, as some of these people here were found to be Y chromosomed, but still have the bodies that we attribute to women because their bodies were insensitive to testosterone. So what is it that we really care about, whether they are genetically female versus male, or whether or not they have the kind of body that puts them into the range that we want to have for our athletics, so that within that range we can be having a contest of training and grit and determination, right? On the other hand, it also means that we're making a lot of judgments about what it means to be female. So this is very recent. This is from July 20th of this year, and we have women who are XX, so they are chromosomally female. And if you parade them in front of a gynecologist, they are genitally female. But their bodies happen to produce more testosterone than typically women produce, which can sometimes give you some different body functions or body strengths. And they're now being told that they have to take a drug to block the extra testosterone. So being a woman is only allowed within certain parameters because, again, we have this notion that there's a biological definition that we are bound to, when really what we should be asking is, what do we want to test? Is it the luck of nature, in which case you have more testosterone, great, you're born taller, great, or are we trying to test something like making everybody exactly the same and then test only their training, in which case we should have not just featherweight and heavyweight boxers, we should have a short person's basketball team, right? Why in some sports do we not care about testing skill, but we only test the luck of being born very, very tall? Race and ethnicity, I'm sure some of you are aware of this, is something that for years was presumably defined by biology, and we had really horrendously abusive and bigoted notions about race that were based on purported genetic or other kinds of biological characteristics, when in fact all they really represented was a history of reproductive isolation due to geography. So when these kinds of categories were being created by Western Europeans, they anointed those people who resembled the people in Western Europe as the smartest and having the best characters. And then as they moved around the planet with East Asia or with Africa or with Native Americans, they continued to assign new characteristics. They would describe these people who had certain physical appearance similarities that really did track with the fact that mostly in the human history, we didn't travel very far before we found a marital partner. So their particular look was being replicated often, and then would denote them as having various terrible characteristics: low intelligence, a tendency toward being devious, a tendency toward being untrustworthy. But we know now that there really is no biological basis for race, that the things that seem to distinguish us based on these superficial appearances are incredibly few, whereas the things that are in common are incredibly many. And that further, if you really wanted to use genetics, we would actually separate people based upon things like the whorls on their fingerprints, which would give us very different groupings of people based on genetics. And if I need one last thing to convince you, it's that you could take a plane ride from JFK after you leave this conference, and if you landed in the Caribbean or in Brazil, your race might change. Because what's defined there as black versus white is defined very differently than it is defined here. Next, family. So we have always had this idea that somehow there is a natural family. I like to call it la famille sauvage, the family in the wild. And that it consists of a biological mother and a biological father with their offspring. And yet, we also know that this does not serve our purposes. We've known this for a very, very long time. In the Roman era, there was adoption of children just for the purpose of having an heir to whom you could pass your property and had nothing to do with biology. And everybody knew that that was the case. Jane Austen's brother, Edward, was adopted into the Knight family, which was a much wealthier family. Her father was a parson, did not have much money, they were pretty strapped. Now, everybody knew that Edward was really a child of the Austen family, but he was raised by the Knights, and he was considered a knight, and he, in fact, inherited much more wealth, and he provided for his biological siblings, gave them a home to come to, but he was not an Austen anymore. And yet everybody understood this, that there was a difference between your biological family and your legal, social, cultural family, however you want to call it. In the 19th and 20th centuries in America, we began to get a little bit confused about some of these things. You know, adoption in the colonial era tended to be really a form of serfdom. You would get children who'd been orphaned and you turn them into workers, and that's the reason why Anne of Green Gables came to be. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, the reform movement said children shouldn't be treated this way, and the way we can treat them better is by making them look exactly like a biological child. Which is why for so many decades, the birth mother and birth father's names were literally erased from the birth certificates, and the adoptive family's names put on the certificate, and the adopted children would often not even be told that they were adopted, or if they did figure it out, they would never have any way to find their original biological parents. For their own benefit, the idea was that the biological family is the only real family, and the only way to protect children from exploitation is to make them part of a real biological family. Again, putting way more importance on biology than on asking ourselves, what are we trying to achieve in terms of child welfare? We finally got to the point where we decided that open adoption is a better approach, which is now the approach for in many cases today, because now we're thinking knowledge is actually the important thing. But what's really weird about today's adoptions is that we still have this attachment to the famille sauvage to the extent that we think you have to have one mother and one father, right? And if you think about it with adoptees, really what they've got is they've got multiple mothers and multiple fathers. These are complex family arrangements. And we know this, and in fact, we deal with it all the time with divorces and stepfamilies, but we don't admit to ourselves that we've come to understand that biology was just insufficient to explain the responsibilities we have to one another. And it got even more confusing when we started adding in reproductive technologies. This is artificial insemination by donor. For those that can't see it, inside every hero there are millions more. They're holding up a little collection cup by his crotch, but this is for IVF Australia. many, many states have statutes that say if a married woman is inseminated by a physician with her husband's consent, then the donor has no legal status with regard to the child, even though he, the donor, is the genetic father. Over here, not that you can read it, is one of many court cases where, for example, a woman was inseminated but not by a doctor. And so does the donor now once again become the legal father because there was no compliance with the statute that relieves him of this responsibility? Why not say that he is a genetic father? There may be a rearing father, or there may be multiple rearing mothers, who knows? And give all of them some acknowledgement and some legal status that we can now ask ourselves, what legal rights and responsibilities do we want that person to have? It may be some, it may be none, it may be lots. Right? Are they going to be custodial? Are they going to have visitation? Are they simply going to be able to be pen pals? But we never ask ourselves, why not just say, not only can you never be too rich or too thin, but you can never have too many people who love you. And then ask, how should the law sort these people out just to make sure that the child is taken care of, instead of making somebody disappear as if he never existed? Similarly, with surrogacy, this is the Baby M case from the mid-1980s, you had cases in which you had a married couple where the woman couldn't carry a pregnancy, and so the husband's sperm was used to inseminate a so-called surrogate mother. I call them contract mothers. And the idea was that she, the surrogate mother, should give the baby up after birth. And the rearing mother would not be genetically or gestationally related to that child. And this led to a tremendous custody battle when Mary Beth Whitehead, who was the so-called surrogate, had changed her mind about releasing the child. And remember, Mary Beth Whitehead was the genetic mother of that child, and she was the woman who gave birth, but she had signed a piece of paper promising to give the child away. And in our system, we were unable to say that both women were mothers. And instead, we had to choose. And it really became, not facetiously, a kind of Solomonic moment in terms of court decisions. It got even more confusing when we got into in vitro fertilization. This is from the 1980s, and a lot of the concern had been about the artificiality of it, about the fear that we were going to lose our sense of family when we could cook a baby, or really more realistically, we could fertilize an embryo, fertilize an egg in a laboratory dish. The Life magazine over here actually has a question, will we still love our children, right? But, IVF was interesting not just because of this kind of break from naturalness, but because it allowed for an increasing number of interventions that never existed before. And one of them was egg donation and gestational surrogacy. Now, Mary Beth Whitehead, the surrogate mother, she was genetically related to the baby she bore, and she was the one who gave birth. She's the one in the hospital who's pushing. In these arrangements, we now have disentangled genetics and gestation. In egg donation, I might be able to carry a pregnancy, and my interviewer here, Sean Carroll, may provide perfectly good sperm, but I have a characteristic that I'm scared to pass on because it has a risk for a disease, and so we use an egg donor. I take one of the many women in the audience and I say, can I get one of your eggs? We'll use in vitro fertilization, we'll use Sean's sperm, but then that fertilized egg will be put back in my body. Now there is a woman who's a genetic mother, but I'm the gestational mother. And in California, again in one of those Solomonic moments, the courts had to decide, well, given that California says that the legal mother is the biological mother, what do we do when we have two people who are both biologically related? One of the first instincts was to say the genetic mother is the real mother, because that's how we decided for men, but that's only because men are such feeble creatures, they can only provide the sperm, they cannot gestate the baby. We, however, are the powerful beings that can do all these things at once, and so it's a more complicated question. Of course, you can reverse it, where it's not egg donation, it's gestational surrogacy. I've got great eggs, and Sean's got great sperm, but I can't carry a pregnancy. I've miscarried multiple times, so we're going to hire somebody who will take this fertilized egg that represents me and Sean, put it in her body, she'll give birth. She's the one pushing and shoving in the hospital. She's the gestational mother, but now I'm the one who wants to take the baby home. So are we going to change our minds about who's the mother depending upon the underlying intent and arrangements? Or are we going to ask biology to solve what is fundamentally a social question? Why struggle with which is the more real biological connection? The birthing, which is what some countries decided in their laws, or the genetics? I will tell you that most countries picked birthing, if only because then you actually knew which woman for sure you were talking about. But there were a few that used genetics. One was South Africa, because it continued to believe that race was a genetic phenomenon. And another was Israel, because the Orthodox rabbis wanted to make sure that we understood whether or not the mother had been Jewish for the purpose of whether or not the child would be considered Jewish under religious law. It leaves this question. Should the egg donor or the gestational surrogate, any of these people, are they strangers, are they aunts, are they mothers? Maybe they're all three at once. My underlying point simply is that we tend to think biology gives us answers to lots of things. In the abortion area, we ask, is this a human life? As if that answers the question about whether or not this is a developing organism that needs to have the same civil rights as somebody who's been born. Those are different questions. One's biological, one's philosophical and legal. Last on this aim, oh wow, this goes very fast. This is what happens when you ask me to do 3 topics, is mitochondrial replacement. Because in your eggs are tiny organelles called mitochondria that also have a tiny bit of DNA. Doesn't deal with what you look like. It's like the little batteries in your cells. What's interesting is that because they pass through the egg, they pass from mother to child. So mother to daughter to granddaughter to great-granddaughter. If you want to trace your ancestry and ask, who am I? One very good way to do it is by going through the mitochondrial line back into time. And yet, some women have bad mitochondria that can cause disease, but they want children who are genetically related, so you can now get a donation of healthy mitochondria from another woman. So now we could have one woman who is the nuclear DNA mother, that's the nose and hair, one who's the mitochondrial mother, that's the kind of ancestral mother, one who's the gestational mother who gives birth, and then, frankly, that baby could be handed off to a 4th woman who is now going to be the rearing mother, and every one of them might have a partner, male or female. So now we've got 8 people, right, who all have some basis to claim parenthood on intent, on gestation, on nuclear genetics, on mitochondria, and my goal in life is to convince people that we don't need to pay attention to the biology so long as we do something we did for people who were missing for 20 years, and that is say, we don't need to follow the biology. We're going to make a legal decision that accomplishes a social purpose, and we're going to have a remedy in case this turns out to be a problem. Last, genome editing, because I know this was promised to you along with designer babies. This emphasis on biology, I think, has had an unfortunate effect of giving us this notion that somehow biology, and in particular genetics, tells us everything about who we are and what we're going to be. And so when you get things like genome editing, which is simply a more efficient way to do genetic engineering than we've had in the past, there's the fear that we are going to somehow use it in untoward ways, and in particular, that we'll use it to change the genes in eggs and sperm and embryos, because that would change the genes in our children and in the grandchildren and great-grandchildren that come. Now, that has been the image of what people think we're doing, that we have the ability to design all kinds of things, and here it's the snip, snails, puppy dog tails, sugar and spice and everything nice that you put into the mix and you design it in, and there comes the baby. This, however, is an even more worrisome thing than the cartoons. This is from a very respectable magazine, and on the cover they didn't put the word fantasy there, I did. They had the baby, and then they say, look, here we're going to design in being a sprinter, perfect pitch, no baldness, high IQ, as if we know what intelligence is, let alone how to create it, low risk of Alzheimer's and 20/20 vision. Let me tell you something. Genetics is only one part of what goes into us, right? There's epigenetics, which tells us how strongly the genes are going to present and operate. We have all kinds of other environmental influences after we're born. We have our own character. There's microbiome now that tells us how our body is actually functioning as a kind of ecosystem. So in fact, more realistically, if we ever did germline editing and change the genes that would transmit through generations, more likely what we would get is the ability to delete the mutation that will almost certainly condemn somebody to Huntington's disease in their midlife. And we might be able to figure out how to reduce, although not eliminate, their risks of Alzheimer's, breast cancer, and some kinds of strokes. That's realistically what germline editing is about, because it's a narrow range of conditions for which we have strong understanding of which particular genetic mutations are actually causing a particular problem, and a strong understanding of what happens if you substitute a healthy version and how that will operate in the baby. I want to conclude simply by noting that to the extent that we think that genes define us, it's also really important to remember that we are all mutants. We are an incredibly complicated collection of traits, genetic and otherwise, which is one of the reasons why, number one, we shouldn't feel bound by our biology when we're trying to organize our lives and our societies, and we shouldn't be fearful of biology when it comes to choosing what kind of children to have and when to have them and with whom. Thanks very much.
Good there. Thank you very much, Alta. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
I like it. You know, what strikes me first when I listen to that talk is you're a professor in the law school. You clearly have to engage seriously with theories and models of moral and ethical philosophy. And you're constantly talking about the most recent advances in biology and medicine. So, like, isn't this a lot of work? Do you get tired of this sometimes?
Somebody here should look at my email account and look at the number of news consolidators I get for science news, medical news, political news, philosophy papers just released, and legal papers just released. And then it's time for dinner. Right?
And should we worry that in the end that these hard decisions are being made by Congress about what laws to pass?
Well, here's the good news. Seriously, in the United States, most of these decisions are not being made by Congress. Because in the United States, we have a tradition that everything is permitted until it's prohibited. That's a fundamental aspect of our culture. And as I mentioned to Sean yesterday, by the way, just for your own amusement, from the 70s, there was I think Newsweek said that East Germany was an example of some place where everything is prohibited until it's permitted, right? The inverse. They said in Russia that everything is prohibited, especially if it's permitted. And my favorite, that in Italy, everything is permitted, especially if it's prohibited. But back to being serious about the answer, we do have a tradition in which things are permitted until prohibited. And that means that, unlike places in Europe who have centralized governments with an unlimited power, and which have passed laws saying this kind of person can use IVF but not that person, or this kind of condition can be eligible for an assisted reproductive technology and that one can't. In the United States, that decision is left up to doctors and their patients. We do have a Food and Drug Administration whose jurisdiction extends to cell therapies and cell transplants, including things like embryos and sperm and eggs, so that we regulate the quality of the products. We make sure that they are safe, that they're free of infection, but we don't regulate how they are used. That's left up to individuals. The bad news is states have more power than Congress, and a lot of states have tried to walk into this area and tell people what they can and cannot do, instead of limiting themselves to simply helping people figure out how to organize their social lives in light of the technologies they're using.
Is it safe to say, it seems to me that a lot of the area of conflict comes from the fact that we human beings, I talked about this in my own talk a little bit yesterday, like we organize the world into certain categories, and we tend to think of these categories as absolutely natural and inviolate, right? Whether it's gender or family or whatever. And as science is progressing, we realize that the boundaries are much blurrier than that. And I think that you were trying to de-emphasize the sort of idea that biology can strictly tell us how to answer some of these questions.
I think if I had to shorten this, I would say biology tells us what we need to know for biology. And it's a guide, but it's not the end of the discussion for questions about law. But it does have this hold on our imaginations, including this idea of what's natural. So in this debate now about whether or not to do so-called germline editing, it's not just about the fear that family relations will be fundamentally altered if we can design our children, which, as I said, overestimates what we could actually design and ignores the evidence of 50 years of IVF and artificial insemination about how we actually love our children regardless. But there's a kind of thread running through this, and it's included in the Oviedo Convention, which a lot of European countries have signed on to under the Council of Europe, that there is a kind of species integrity of Homo sapiens, and that editing would somehow violate that integrity. And it's a romanticized notion of what it means to be a species. It assumes that genes only flow vertically from parent to child, as opposed to all the horizontal crossing that we actually know goes on, as well as crossing between species. Every one of us has non-human genes in our very cells that actually we wouldn't be able to live without. And it also assumes that species are hard boundaries. And the ecologists will tell us, and I think I'm going to miss the talk on evolutionary theory, unfortunately, that it's actually a blurry concept. Some of it has to do with whether or not species can reproduce with one another. Well, that may be because they're infertile together, or it may be that they never live in the same place at the same time. I have a colleague who goes to sleep at 9 p.m., and I don't wake up until 9 a.m., which is why I was so silly before on my 2-minute thing. And we hardly ever talk because we've got a very short window in which we can actually communicate. And so we tend to take a very simplified vision of the atom with its circles, yeah, or of species, and then use it to our detriment in defining what we will allow ourselves to do with our technological power.
So we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Step right up to the microphones if you'd like to ask a question. Keep them short and in the form of questions.
I don't think the microphone is on, I'm sorry.
Now it is.
I just saw a film about triplets. I'm sure everybody knows this. I don't even know what I'm asking you to comment on, but do you have a comment on that film?
I've been accused of being able to talk about anything, so it doesn't matter if I've seen the film, which I've not, but I've heard about. Right?
Do you want
and it
me
even
to give
came
you
up
a quick?
Yeah, it came up in discussion.
The film is about 3 triplets who are split up at birth and adopted by 3 different families. And they follow them, and they discover each other when they're in their young 20s. It is a shocking film.
Well, first of all, it's a shockingly unethical experiment to divide children up into families of different economic strata just to see how that affects the way they grow up, because you're looking at, nature versus nurture. But more to the point, there are going to be remarkable similarities among twins raised apart because of things like their body types are similar, so they may gravitate toward the same kinds of sports. I never gravitated toward basketball, right? But if I were tall, I might have, and if my twin were tall, I might have as well. I favor colors that look good against my skin tone, so my house will probably be decorated in those colors. There are ways you can understand some of the ways these similarities occur that are not magical. They tell us that genetics has an important role to play, but not the only role to play.
All right, over here.
Okay, so during your presentation, you were talking about the Olympics and how women, if they have too much testosterone, they have to take a drug to lower that. So does the same apply to men who might have too much estrogen, but they're physically males?
Well, as far as I know, no. Now, this is very new. Remember, that was a July 20th, 2018 article I took that from. But a man who had too much estrogen, if that affected his upper body strength in a way, wouldn't be an issue for the Olympics because he would never have competed well enough to be at the Olympics to be tested. Right? So it's only those things that seem to enhance your competitive edge that come to the attention of the authorities, not those things that might purportedly make it more difficult for you to succeed athletically.
Don't these legal constructs that you try to establish in terms of rules always evolve into some form of discrimination against poor people? Because in this global society, if you started setting up rules against gene editing, if you were a person of means, you could go somewhere else in the world and get this procedure or whatever you want done. But if you didn't have the financial means, then you won't be able to do that. So, I mean...
Yeah, so I co-chaired the National Academy's committee that set out a set of recommendations about genome editing, and we heard from a lot of critics, and some of the critics said this is terrible because it's an insult to humanity and humanity's genome and the integrity of the species, and others argued, as you said, that and it won't be available to everybody because only rich people will be able to afford it. And do you remember Woody Allen movie where he talked about how the food here is so bad and the portions are so small? That was the nature of the criticism. They really had to make up their minds. But yes, almost any new technology is going to have a pattern of being very expensive in the beginning that only some people can access, and then some of them will eventually become less expensive. And it's one of the reasons why I personally tend to favor regulating things in terms of the quality of the product rather than prohibiting things, because it's going to happen somewhere, and regulation gives you a better chance of controlling it. And that also allows you to have an opportunity to then ask, as a social matter, what kind of economic supports should we provide so that it's accessible to a wider group of people?
We have time for one more question if it's very quick.
Can you think of anywhere in the world that's in the process of changing their policies about these types of things?
Yes. So not here, because the Congress now has in the budget a provision that says that the Food and Drug Administration cannot even entertain an application to start a clinical trial for germline editing. But for the editing that you would do, for example, to try and treat a problem in, let's say, a hemophiliac or somebody with muscular dystrophy who's already been born, that's gene therapy that's already going on here in a regulated way. But when it comes to germline, that is probably going to happen first in the United Kingdom. They were the first to really go forward with IVF. They are the first to go forward with mitochondrial replacement. And they now have their most influential bioethics council coming out with a report on July 18th that set out a case, as we did for the national academies, for the ethical defensibility of germline editing when it's really the only good choice left. The difference is here the Congress will stop it because it's a collateral damage of the abortion wars. And in the UK, they have a very comprehensive regulatory scheme, one we couldn't have. They actually do say, this clinic can do it, that one can't, this doctor, that one can't. But because of that, and because abortion is not the divisive issue there that it is here, for them it's fox hunting, they can go forward with it. And they will be the leaders on the globe.
All right, thanks everybody, and thank Alta again.